Throughout this draft season, we're going to keep telling you about the players that we love and think that you should draft. We're also going to talk about the players that aren't getting any love from us on draft day. Your league mates might love them. Let them draft them. You should avoid them.
If you can't wait to start drafting fantasy football teams, you don't have to. Underdog Fantasy has drafts going on all offseason with tons of unique and fun formats. Not to mention their flagship Best Ball Mania 5, where one lucky winner will become a millionaire. Plus, they already have pick'em lines ready for week 1 of the NFL season and their new streak format where you can win 1,000 times your entry. Just go to UnderdogFantasy.com and sign up using promo code ENDGAME to get a special pick'em that you can't get anywhere else, plus up to $250 in bonus cash.
All right, Chris, who is first on your do not draft list?
Well, first on my list is Travis Etienne. Now, let me start by saying he's not a complete do not draft for me. My issue with Travis Etienne is where he is being drafted when you look at sites like ESPN or Yahoo. He's typically going late second round, and I don't think that's where I am comfortable taking Travis Etienne. I think this is too early. Now, it's easy to look at Travis Etienne and say, what? This guy's crazy. He was the RB3 last year, and you're right. But I always say this, fantasy football is a weekly game. It's a game where you play every week against one person. You're just trying to win that 1 week every single week. It doesn't matter what a guy did all season if he was only good for a short stretch of time. And that's kind of what we saw from Travis Etienne last year. And this is coming from somebody who had Travis Etienne in multiple leagues, by the way. If you look at it from weeks 5 through week 8 before the team's bye, he scored 22 or more fantasy points in each of those games. I remember thinking at the time, yes, I have a league winner. Travis Etienne is going to win me a fantasy championship across multiple leagues this year. Then what happened in the second half? He only scored 15 or more fantasy points 3 times the rest of the year. He only went over 20 points 1 time. Now, thankfully, it was in week 17, if you made it to week 17 with Travis Etienne, but he really wasn't that good. 6 times last year, 10 or fewer fantasy points. This is not a second round pick. A second round pick is not a guy that gets you, 4 or 5 20-point games and 5 or 6 single digit games. You need more from your second round pick. I need more from my second round picks. And now the Jaguars, all they're talking about this year, all Doug Peterson is talking about, well, not all, he's talking about other stuff, but one of the big things he keeps talking about over and over, we need to reduce Travis Etienne's workload. We need to take pressure off Travis Etienne. So now we're talking about a guy who I don't think was as good last year as people remember, who might see a reduced workload this year. And again, you've got to draft this guy in the second round of your draft. This is still stud territory. This is still week winning upside with a very high floor territory. I don't want a guy that's more kind of boom or bust, who had more busts last year than booms, who might see a reduced workload. So nothing against Travis Etienne. I think Travis Etienne will still be good this year, but I think if you draft him in the second round, you're going to wish you hadn't.
Yeah, I've got some questions about that Jags offense too, but we'll save that for later. Let's talk about one I think might be a very polarizing player on draft day all season long. It's former league winner Cooper Kupp. Now, you're probably either in the camp of he's a steal, he's going to be back, he's going to dominate, or this guy's washed, I'm not touching him. I was kind of trying to convince myself, well, if he falls to the right round, if it's a good value, I could see a path. And I realize now that that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to convince myself that I still want to take him. And now I have just really realized I don't. I don't want any part of this. I don't want to take on the risk because he is still being drafted as if he has that league winner in him. And I'm sorry, there are a lot of reasons why it's not going to happen. The obvious one is just injuries, right? So many injuries, not just last year, but throughout his career, right? Let's face it, this is not a new thing last year where for the first time ever he got hurt, okay? But the injuries, I guess, advanced age for an NFL player, not that he's that old, but, when you got that wear and tear plus the injuries, it takes its toll. He just didn't look like the same guy even when he was on the field. Last year, his success rate against man coverage dropped quite a bit, down to 65%, below league average. And so, yeah, he can still win in the zone, but here's the other thing. He's not going to get all the targets in that offense anymore because they have a new number 1 receiver. You might have heard of him. His name is Puka Nacua. And so, yes, some people will point to the fact that Kupp was injured and say, well, Puka became the guy because Kupp was hurt. But then you look at the fact that even when Kupp did come back and was supposedly healthy and playing towards the second half of the season, Puka was still the number 1 receiver by far. And Puka, let's face it, is not just younger, but also at this point, the better receiver. Yeah, I know. Controversial, take that for what it's worth, but the facts and the statistics bear it out. Puka is still going to be the number one receiver on this team. Now, Cup still has value, but am I going to take him in round 3 or even round 4? I don't think so because the risk is way too high. And even if Cup is still good, again, this is not a player who's going to help you win your league, especially if you're drafting him that early. Those big plays are not there anymore. He averaged just 7.2 average depth of target last year, only 7.3 yards per target. Those numbers are okay, but again, you're looking at a guy who's what, your number 2 receiver, maybe your number 1 receiver if you go RB and you want okay. Sorry, his prime is past. I think that we can definitely say that. He's not the top target. He's not going to get as many targets, and the injury risk is too high. All that together, why would I take him? And another guy who dominated his position until last year.
Yeah, speaking of past his prime, I think sadly Travis Kelce is probably past his prime. Now, don't get me wrong, Travis Kelce was still good last year, but there are definitely some red flags that we saw with Travis Kelce last year. Number one, you look at it, go back to 2020. This is a guy who ranked number 1 or number 2 in routes run among tight ends every year until last year when that dropped all the way to 8th. This is also a guy who routinely played 85, 90% of the snaps. Last year, what did we see? Less than 80% of the snaps. I think this is what the Chiefs envision Travis Kelce's role becoming, a less and less role here because they need this guy for the real playoffs, the NFL playoffs. They want him fresh and healthy for the NFL playoffs for the stretch run. So I think this year we're going to see an even more reduced role for Travis Kelce because this year the Chiefs can reduce his role more because, of course, they went out, they signed Hollywood Brown, they drafted Xavier Worthy, they still have Rashee Rice, who doesn't look like he's going to miss any games with suspension. They aren't going to need Travis Kelce to be the guy, week in and week out like they did for many years. Even when Tyreek Hill was there, he was basically their number 2 wide receiver. That's not going to be the case anymore. They can lessen his workload, lessen his targets, keep him fresh throughout the season, keep him fresh for the NFL playoffs. He's getting up there in age. There's no reason to have him out there 85, 90% of the snaps, running a ton of routes, and risking injury when you have all these weapons on this offense. And this is a guy who's still being drafted typically as a number 2 tight end off the board. And I just don't think he's going to have that kind of upside this season. Again, another guy, he'll probably be fine. Like if you draft him, he's probably not going to be an outright bust. But you're probably going to wish you had just waited on tight end and taken somebody else. Do you want to win your fantasy league but don't have time to do all the research? Are you tired of drafting mediocre teams and then having to constantly hope you hit it big on the waiver wire just to compete? Do you wish you could have a fantasy expert like Pierre or myself with you while you draft? Well, now you can. With our app DraftLane and our live draft pilot, we will guide you through every pick of your draft and tell you exactly which players we would pick if we were on the clock. Our proprietary algorithm will take into account your league settings, scoring, and roster requirements to identify the best picks every time you are on the clock to ensure you have a winning team from week 1. It's the closest thing you can get to having us there drafting with you. Get the biggest edge in fantasy football. Just go to your app store and search for DraftLane and download it today and get ready to dominate your draft.
And I guess I'm going back to the well with this one. Last year, I was off Josh Jacobs. This year, I'm still off of Josh Jacobs. Going to a new team, definitely a better team, better offense. Nope, doesn't help. In fact, it makes me even more down on Josh Jacobs. And here's why. Well, first of all, the big appeal with Josh Jacobs is he's one of those elusive bell cows, right? The guy who gets all the touches in the backfield. And that was the case with the Raiders because who else was going to get touches? Well, except this year it's going to be Zamir White, who should have been getting touches all along. But anyways, Green Bay just does not roll like that. Talked about this way back in the summer when Josh Jacobs was still there. He had been signed, and, they also decided to draft a running back in Marshawn Lloyd, who, granted, it wasn't a super early draft pick, but it was early enough to know that he's going to have a significant role. And this is a player who is going to see more touches than people think because Josh Jacobs is not going to see as many touches as you think. He's not going to be used the way he's been used before. Green Bay, they like to use a 1-2 punch at running back, and Josh Jacobs, well, he really doesn't need that many touches either because honestly, he's starting to wear down a little bit. This is why I don't regret being off him last year. Average only 3.5 yards per carry. He was the RB 28 in terms of fantasy scoring. You say, yeah, he missed a couple of games. Okay, fine. How about points per game? The RB 18. And I don't see that really going up this year with probably fewer touches. This is also a team that probably won't run the ball as much. Green Bay can pass the ball more. In fact, they probably will even more than last year because Jordan Love really took off in the second half. And so Jacobs, yes, still has some value, but people are viewing him as potentially an RB1 for their fantasy team. Way too much risk for me. And let's also not forget the fact that he's got so much wear and tear already. That's why he broke down toward the end of last year. Wouldn't be surprised if it happens again. So, all told, Josh Jacobs, I don't see him more as like a high end RB2, maybe even a mid range RB2, which means I'm not getting him in drafts, and I'm okay with that. And it's not just experienced players that we're avoiding. Sometimes the young, new, upcoming studs are draft landmines.
Yes, and I think your league mates overvalue CJ Stroud. Look, CJ Stroud for a rookie quarterback was great last year, no doubt about it. But for fantasy, I think people remember him being way better than he really was. Look, he had 4,100 yards, that's great. 23 touchdowns, that's okay. He averaged 18 points per game last year. And he was very up and down throughout the season, right? You'd have like these really big games and then these not so big games. Now, I know everybody's excited for him in year two, excited that they added Stephon Diggs, but I do worry that, he's still being overvalued greatly by most of your league mates. Like, they think CJ Stroud is going to be a top 5 QB this year just because of what he did as a rookie and because the Texans added Stephon Diggs. In order for CJ Stroud to be a top 5 QB, he's going to have to put up huge passing numbers because you get nothing on the ground from this guy. 167 rushing yards. That's basically nothing over the course of a season. So CJ Stroud is going to have to make a leap like 4,500 passing yards, 35 plus touchdowns to pay off a top 5 QB price. That's such a huge increase from year one to year two. I think he could get around 4,000 yards again. I think he could maybe get close to 30 touchdowns, but that's probably not going to make him a top 5 QB. I just think there are better QBs going after CJ Stroud in fantasy, maybe not in real life, but in fantasy, who give you way more upside than he does. So let one of your league mates get all excited to draft CJ Stroud in the second year and just go ahead and take one of those other guys later who can give you plenty more upside, like Kyler Murray, Dak Prescott, etc., etc. Maybe even Jordan Love at the end of your draft, who have much more upside and not as much risk because you're getting them later in the draft.
All right, as promised, going back to Jacksonville. I know everybody loves rookies, and we just assume every one of those top rookies that was drafted in the first couple rounds is going to explode and be great in the NFL. And that would be wonderful if it were true, but it's not. It's a fairy tale. So even a guy as talented as Brian Thomas Jr., I just don't see it happening, at least not yet. So here's the thing. Brian Thomas is basically filling Calvin Ridley's shoes and filling the Calvin Ridley role, right? I mean, that's why they took him, because Ridley's gone. So if you had Ridley last year in fantasy, that doesn't necessarily give you the warm fuzzies because Ridley was probably the most annoying player to have in fantasy because he was truly boom or bust. That's great in best ball. Look, that's fine. And you know what? I'll take Brian Thomas Jr. in an underdog draft. Sure, no problem. I'm not taking him in redraft, not because of the volatility, right? Almost every receiver has those ups and downs. But we're going to assume that in year one, again, first year here, is going to just all of a sudden be as good as Calvin Ridley. I'm not assuming that. But also, it's just this Jacksonville offense in general. And Chris, you talked about it, with Etienne and the run game. I don't really feel great about this pass game. We saw toward the second half that entire offense just collapse. All right. Second year under Press Taylor, offense coordinator, Doug Peterson still there. They showed absolutely no creativity. And that's why Ridley was so easily shut down at times because they didn't move him around, right? They didn't do anything different. They just had him do the same thing over and over again. And once in a while it worked, and once in a while it didn't. And then you're asking a rookie like Thomas to pick up the game and start to beat these corners one on one. It's going to be harder than it sounds. So I think he'll have his moments and I think he'll be okay. But I don't see this as a year one explosion. I don't see this as a guy who's really going to make you happy that you had him in your lineup on a weekly basis. So I also have some concerns about Trevor Lawrence really earning and deserving that contract he got. But let's save that for another video. Look, Brian Thomas Jr. is a talented player. I just don't think he's in the right position to succeed. Taking those players where they're currently being drafted might be a mistake. Speaking of, these are some things you don't want to do. These are draft mistakes you want to avoid.